Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look inside of the Toyota 2AZ-FE 2.4 liter 4-cylinder engine to see what's inside and how it works. Now you probably heard about this engine already, most commonly found in the Toyota Camry and RAV4 of the mid-2000s, and there's many other Toyotas that you find this in. However, it is pretty notorious and it does have a couple failure points, which means you should probably avoid this if you're trying to buy a used Toyota. So we're going to tear this down to see what those failure points are and what you could do if you've already got one of these. Starting at the top here, you can see we've got a magnesium alloy metal valve cover. This is before they switched over to plastic. This engine only has port injection. You've got your intake ports over here, and further down here we have this foam here that wraps around the block. It's an aluminum block as well as an aluminum upper oil pan, followed by a steel oil pan down below. Now this did have a timing chain inside, this being the intake side and this side being the exhaust, but this is the front of the vehicle. You've got your variable valve timing only on the intake side here through this solenoid. Then at the front here you've got all your accessories. You've also got your timing chain tensioner, which can be accessed from this little port over here. And then of course we've got our belt tensioner, crank pulley, and the water pump, which is separately driven from the timing side. Now taking a look at the front side of this engine, this was only a front wheel drive application. We do have your plastic thermostat housing over here next to the water pump, your bypass tube over here. This is where your exhaust will be located over here, and you've got the oil filter way down at the bottom over here. Now in all honesty, I don't really know why this engine's here or it's failed, but I have a feeling that the low oil level might be part of it. I don't see anything on that dipstick. Yeah, the oil that's coming out of it is pretty black, and there really isn't that much of it, so something's definitely up with the oiling system. First thing we're going to do is knock off this valve cover here. You just remove the valve cover, and there's the gasket. And you can see what's inside this valve cover. We've got our baffle over here. This here is where your oil fill is. Then we've got the spark plug tube seal gasket. You can see how this is super crusty, and that's what's going to allow your spark plugs to leak oil if this gasket's leaking. But taking a look under this engine's valve cover, right away you can see it's powered by a timing chain. The timing chain is nice and tight, so I don't suspect a timing issue there. We've got your double overhead cams. This is your exhaust side, this here is your intake side, and they act directly upon the valves to these valve buckets over here. There's no roller rocker arm system. Over on this side here we've got our cam position sensor that's going to pick up signals from this wheel that rolls around here. That's because the intake side has this variable valve timing gear over here. The exhaust side does not have that. Now in order to get the head bolts, I do have to remove the camshaft, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these cam cap bearings over here so we can get the camshaft off. Alright, the camshafts here do have a little bit of scoring on them, as well as the inside of the cam cap covers. So I'm wondering if there was an oiling issue with this engine. Now, in order to get the camshafts off, I need to remove the timing cover, but before I do that, I gotta get all these accessories off, including this crank bolt. And this is a Toyota, so I'm pretty sure it's gonna be stuck. Now before I turn the engine over to hold the crank, I'm gonna remove all these accessories. So we're gonna first start with the water pump pulley here. I'm gonna remove the tens for the water pump. Now at least the water pump has a metal impeller, Volkswagen. And there's a good set of 14mm bolts all around this timing cover and this tensioner that I'm going to remove next. And this here is your belt tensioner. This is the spring here that it rides against. You can see this one's broken. There's your engine bracket. I just find it interesting that the timing cover is held on by 14s and 12s. Most other engines have 10mm bolts for this. You can imagine giving one of these engines head job on one of these, that you'd have to remove everything that sits in front of the timing chain cover and the crankshaft just to get the timing side of the engine out so you can lift the head off. But that's not uncommon with engines, but especially given this engine's history for stripping out head bolts, that's probably a common repair on these. Now this is where the crank position sensor is located. Can you yank it out? Over here is where the variable valve timing solenoid that controls this gear is located. There we are. It's just an oil control solenoid with a coil inside of here that activates this little spring in here, and that's going to control the flow of oil going to that cam gear. And over here, this here is the chain tensioner. You can see it's one giant spring loaded but also hydraulic. If you look down inside of here, we got one hole over here, and then there's another hole over here, which is what's going to take the hydraulic oil and help push against the timing chain to keep this thing in tension. At least the teeth mechanism on here looks properly made, unlike Volkswagen. Over here on the front of the engine, we've got the bracket here that goes to the oil dipstick, and then we have the crossover tube that goes over to the other side to bypass the thermostat. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these 10mm bolts. There's the bypass tube, and here's the dipstick. Here's the thermostat housing. I believe on the older ones they used to use a metal one, and now they've changed it over to a plastic one. And then here's your thermostat, just a standard thermostat like any other vehicle. Because I can't get the crank bolt off and then the timing cover, I'm gonna go ahead and flip the engine over, literally. And that's gonna make a big mess, of course. Oh my gosh. So we're making a giant mess on the ground here. Luckily I got some of my wife's clothes nearby. Basically all the oil that was in the oil pan that didn't drain out. Now with the engine rotated, I can go ahead and attack this oil pan. Bunch of 10mm bolts holding this stamped steel on. Just remove that oil pan. Yeah, it looks pretty sludged. And I see something metallic in there. I'm not sure if you can see, but there's a lot of shiny particles in there. And that was one of the defects of this engine, is that they would run low on oil. And the type of people who use these cars, they just use them like furniture. They don't care for the oil. And then you end up spinning a bearing and getting nice sparkles in your oil pan. Alright, so I jammed something inside of the engine here. Let's see if I can get the crank bolt to break loose. Okay, that wasn't too bad. Look at all that mess on the ground. Anyways, with the engine back up, I can remove the crank bolt. Here's your harmonic balancer. You're getting all the bolts out for the timing cover. And finally remove the timing cover. This is made of metal, unlike Volkswagen's. Now looking a little closer, you can see this here is where the timing chain tensioner sat. And it would have sat over here to push down on this chain over here. And that's what gives this tension. Now you can see there's no more tension in this. And I can slowly loose this chain off. Taking a look at the timing chain setup on this engine. Over here you can see we've got this gear, which is the one that feeds that crank position sensor we saw earlier. Over here we've got the crankshaft. It's got its gear on here. That's going to drive your double overhead cams, intake and exhaust. And you've got two timing chain slides, one over here and the other one here, which has a tensioner on it. Okay, then I can take off the exhaust side. And then I can slowly remove this chain here. Take off the intake side gear. And then the chain can slide off of its crank. Now I'll also remove the intake and the exhaust side camshafts. Remove that timing chain guide and that timing chain slide, and that pretty much frees up the timing side of the engine from the head. Last thing before we get the head off, let's get the fuel rail off. Now this engine is only port injected. It's got two 12mm nuts here. And there's your fuel rail. I do have another video on how fuel injectors work, so you want to check that out, linked above. The one unique thing with this engine is they've incorporated a foam around the engine block, which goes below the intake. And when your head gasket starts to leak, due to the head bolt stripping out back here, this thing gets wet. So you might be able to see this from underneath the vehicle, soaking wet with coolant. And this engine's got a single knock sensor. Now the head bolts in many Toyotas are a bi-hexagon 10mm. Now you can kind of get away with using a regular hex 10mm. That shouldn't strip it out, but it won't give you the ideal amount of force. This is going in a scrap anyways. I'm actually surprised it's not as tight as I thought it would be. So now that they're all loose, I'm going to go ahead and zip these off. So you can see here these are actually a 12 point, meanwhile your hex is actually a 6 point. This is not a standard 12 point socket though. It's a bi-hex, not a triple square. Toyota's still using washers on these head bolts. A lot of people have moved away from them because it's just another part that you could forget. I just put a flange on the head instead. Alright, now I can lift off the engine head. And this engine uses a typical multi-layer steel gasket. You can see there's two layers in here. So I don't know if you can see this, but you can watch as I move the engine up and down. Cylinder 1 moves, but cylinder 4 is kind of lagging. And I can feel that there's a bit of play in this one here, so I'm guessing that this is the rod that spun the bearing, causing that slackness, and therefore this engine was knocking. So I just turned the engine upside down and this piece of plastic fell out. This actually sits inside of the coolant chamber around the pistons. So here we are now at the bottom of the engine. We have our oil pickup tube over here, followed by the oil pump, which is driven off the crankshaft. We've also got this big assembly here, and that's actually your balance shaft, because this is a 4-cylinder engine. You need to have this balance shaft assembly in order to cancel out some vibrations, especially given the passenger economy minded vehicles that this engine sits in. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start removing these 12mm bolts that hold the oil pump on. There we are. And here you can see the oil pump assembly. It's got a pickup tube over here. It doesn't look too clogged up inside of there, but there is a bit of sludge hanging around here. So the balance shaft assembly has 12mm bolts. Gonna resort to the old school method. It's a balance shaft assembly cover here. You can see it's got bearings just like the camshaft bearings. Holy, these actually look kind of worn out. You can see there's lines on them here. And you can see the way these balance shafts work is you got these weights over here on one side and one on the other side, and they spin in opposite directions because they're keyed together. And they're also keyed to a big gear on the crankshaft, which you're going to see later. So the crankshaft rotates, these weights are also going to rotate counter to the weights that are on the crankshaft down inside of there, and that's what's going to cancel out those vibrations. You can see how the weights are just half moon weights. And this one over here, this gear here is what drives this gear on the crankshaft. See what this oil filter has inside. I don't see anything obvious or clogged up. So the rest of the upper oil pan here is all held in by 12mm bolts. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. So in order to get this upper oil pan off, there's one more hidden bolt inside of here. You need a 12mm hex, but I don't have that. Alternatively, you can also use a bolt and drop that in there and then double nut this bolt to wind it out. But I'm just going to use a hammer and a chisel, and that allows it to get turned out of there. And then there's my hidden 12mm bolt. Now I can remove this upper oil pan. Here. So we've got a clear view of the crankshaft here. You got the 4 cylinders with their connecting rods and then 5 main bearing caps. These are all held in with 12-point sockets, 14 and 12mm. Here we've got the pressed on ring that's going to power that balance shaft that was on top of here. And this little guy here is your oil pump tensioner. At the back here we've got a rear main seal, so sometimes if that leaks you're going to see oil coming out of your transmission to engine area. You can see this is the connecting rod that was knocking. It's very loose because there's no bearing in there, and you can also see the discoloration on top of this connecting rod cap compared to say this one that's fine and there's no play. So this is the problem in this engine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the connecting rod caps. 12.12mm bolts. These ones are a lot looser. Alright, we'll zip these off. Oh, at least there's a bearing on this one. But bro, it's in really rough shape. Look at that, it's all chewed up. Alright, check out these pistons. Look at this bearing, it's absolutely chewed up. You can see the material starting to squeeze out the edges here, and that's just due to a lack of oil in this engine. If we look at the piston heads themselves, you can see they are full of carbon. This one moves freely. This one here, it's a bit stiff. Again, that could be due to the lack of oil. Also, the oil rings in here, basically non-existent. Look at that. That's the spring in there, and this is the oil ring all clogged up. Yeah, its bearing is in pretty rough shape as well. Not as bad as the 2 and 3 though. And this here is the connecting rod that spun the bearing. You can see there's no bearing on this side. And it's all chewed up on the inside of this connecting rod cap. There's actually no bearing on this crankshaft or on this connecting rod. The bearing is completely gone. This was our knocker. This one had no bearing on the inside, which means that you're left with that much gap between this and the crankshaft over here. And that's why it's knocking all the way around. It's all chewed up in here. And this bearing's chewed up as well. It's all due to lack of oil. These are 14mm 12-point sockets for the main bearing bolts. So I'm going to remove these main bearing caps. And there's a little bit of scoring in here, but it doesn't seem like the main bearings suffer too much. So by far I think this middle main bearing here was the one that suffered the most. You can see it's a little bit scored up, but I don't see any damage to the crankshaft. Go ahead and pull out this crankshaft here, and then we'll get the block off the stand. So here we've got the entire engine taken apart, laid out here. We're going to have a closer look at some of these components and their failure modes. So we'll start right at the top of the engine here with the valve cover. Now the 2AZ FE was known to be a real good oil burner, and that's what probably caused this engine to fail. And one of the causes for that, this is an 08 Camry, so it's a later model 2AZ engine, is the fact that they started to switch over from 530 to 520 and 0W20. It's right here on the oil cap, and of course thinner oil is not going to help the situation when your engine's prone to burning a lot of oil. Now one thing you could do to help a little bit with oil consumption is to change out the PCV valve, which is right on top of the engine. It's super easy to get to, and this ventilates the valve cover and thus the crankcase back into the intake system. So if you don't want that oil returning, you have to have a properly functioned PCV check valve, which is going to let the oil stay inside the engine but allow the ventilation air to escape. If it's clogged up or it's stuck stuck open, it's not going to do its job, and all that oil is going to escape back into the intake, and you're going to burn oil. Next, we're going to move over to the engine head here, where you can see you've got the valve buckets. Now this camshaft here is going to ride directly up on those valves. There's no rocker arm mechanism in the way. It's a very simple design. The newer version to this engine, the 2AR FE, which ultimately solved a lot of issues with this engine, has a much more complicated rocker arm system that sits on top of this to push it down on the valves. If you want to check out that video, check out the link above. Now the only thing with this design is that you might have to do a valve clearance job every so often, and that's because the valve clearance is set according to that number that's printed inside of there, and that's because there's a clearance that sits in between this valve and this rocker. There's no hydraulic lifters here to fill up the gap between here the way the newer engines are. Perhaps a little difficult to see, but the valves inside of there are nice and clean, and that's because we have a port injected system only. There's no direct injection, which means that the fuel is going to spray directly on those valves and clean them off, and you don't have to do a carbon walnut blast like you would on a direct injected Hyundai or BMW. Now taking a look underneath the head here, you'll notice that all the spark plugs have this white tip on them, and that indicates that this engine was probably burning a lot of oil, which is again typical for this engine. Other than that though, from a design perspective, there's 4 valves per cylinder and it's very simple and straightforward. That's one key thing about this engine. It's very easy to maintain and very easy to work on, and mechanically it's very straightforward. Check out the wear on this camshaft bearing over here. Probably due to the lack of oil when they ran this thing low. Now next we're going to take a look at the block itself. And inside of this cooling jacket here is where I found this plastic insert. Not sure why Toyota does that all the time, but you can see here it's a very simple, basic open deck design, very easy to work on. And one good thing about this engine is that it's fairly light. The block really doesn't have much features to it other than the cooling passage up at the front here, and then the water pump, which is housed over here. That's going to circulate coolant through here and then back out through the thermostat. Now one of the major flaws with the 2AZ engine were these rear 3 head bolts that would strip out of the aluminum block. It was a very common thing on the earlier engines from the early 2000s. They seem to have fixed it in the later 2000s. But essentially what would happen is once these 3 here would start to lose tension, it's going to cause the head to slightly open up. You're going to allow coolant to leak out the back onto that foam that we saw earlier. When you don't have any coolant in here, but it's going to cause the engine to overheat and possibly warp the head. Now all of the symptoms are going to point to overheating, a coolant leak, or low compression in the cylinders, but in fact it's actually just these rear 3 head bolts. Now there's a bunch of Healy coil kits that you can buy out there to drill this hole out, and then you can put the insert inside and then properly tighten down your head bolts so this problem does not occur again. However, it is a big job to do. As you saw, just to get the head off, you got to get all the timing components off, the crank bolt, the timing cover, all the accessories have to come off, and then you can get to the head. You might have to take the head to the machine shop so they can check for flatness. While that's being done, you do your Healy coil inserts over here. Now all of that's not going to cost you much in parts, but it's going to cost you a lot in labor, and on an older vehicle like an early 2000s Camry, it's pretty much going to total the vehicle out. But if you're looking to buy one of these with the earlier engines in them, you can take a look at the back where this foam sits over here to see if there's any coolant seeping out, or you can also see if the engine overheats after a long drive. But essentially there's nothing you can do in order to prevent this because it's just a manufacturing flaw with these rear 3 bolts. Now, so next we come to the next major flaw in the 2AZ engine, and that's in the piston design. Earlier 2AZ engines were still known to burn a lot of oil. I know because my first car was a 2003 Toyota Camry with the 4-cylinder engine, and it did burn a lot of oil. However, in the newer Camrys like this one, they've redesigned the head and they've actually made it worse. You can see over here you've got 2 compression rings, and then you've got the oil control ring, which is this bottom ring over here, and it's comprised of 2 small rings with a spring in between. However, this oil control ring tends to gum up. You can see here this one's all gummed up, and the oil that's being sprayed and applied to the cylinder wall can no longer make it back through the holes that are drilled inside of the piston head over here to return the oil back to the bottom of the sump, and instead they end up past the rings and go on the top of the piston where it gets combusted and it burns a lot of oil. Now, while most engines burn oil in the same way, the problem is exaggerated by the fact that this engine was applied in millions of vehicles, and the type of demographic who drives them just use them like appliances. They don't really check the oil very often, and what's going to happen is it's just going to build up over time, and then you're slowly going to lose the amount of engine oil that you have in the engine. Now, when you run your engine too low in oil, we've got these connecting rod bearings here that are going to rotate on the crankshaft. These bearings here are now going to basically seize up against the crankshaft, and they're going to want to rotate themselves, which is going to go around this way to the other side, and that's called spinning a bearing. So now you've got 2 bearings on this side and you got no bearing on this side. Well, that means there's a gap here between here and the crankshaft, and that's what's going to cause that knocking sound. Now eventually, if you keep driving, things are just going to get worse because that knocking sound is now going to start eating away at the connecting rod itself or the cap, and then it's eventually going to grenade itself. I'm going to take apart this oil control ring so we can have a closer look here. Look at how thin this ring is, and you can see how gummed up it is with carbon. That's actually supposed to collect all the oil and put it back through this over here on this side, where it can go back underneath the piston through these little holes that you see here and return down the piston head. So over here on the piston you can see there's a spring here that sits inside of here, and those inside of there are supposed to be the return holes that return oil back down this piston head, and you can see that they're all clogged up and gummed up. But essentially you can see just how small these holes are. They're not big enough to return the amount of oil that's supposed to go in here, so they have a tendency to gum up really fast. This one's completely clogged up. There's no space for oil to go in between these rings over here and go down into those return holes. That's just going to cause this engine to burn a lot of oil. Now if you do have one of these engines with this problem, there's not really too much you can do. You could try putting additives in the engine oil in order to free these rings up, but the real way to do it is to take everything apart and clean it. Now Toyota's actually redesigned these piston heads as part of a technical service bulletin, where you would get new piston heads as well as new rings on your engine if it burned a certain amount of oil. It's kind of a patch fix, but they didn't officially release a recall. So if you are lucky enough to get the recall done, or you're willing to pay for the piston heads, there definitely is a fix for this, but it's going to be a very expensive job. Hopefully though, once it's rebuilt, it shouldn't have this problem and burn any more oil. While we're on the topic of oil burning engines, we're going to take a quick look at the lubrication setup on this motor here. So you can see here we've got our oil pickup tube, which is connected to the oil pump, sitting inside of the oil pan. It's going to create oil flow, which is then going to push it down through this hole over here on the upper oil pan. It's then going to be sent straight over to the oil filter to get filtered out. The oil filter is then going to send its oil through the top of the oil pan over here through this little track, where it's going to then head down into the block. Let's take a quick look to see what's inside of this oil pump. Okay, take this apart here. You can see the housing. And then here we've got the oil pump. Now the oil is going to come in over here from this side. It's going to head under the pump, and then this pump is going to rotate, creating the fluid flow. It's then going to push the oil back out this way, where it's going to exit onto the upper oil pan. Now because we have a balance shaft assembly inside of this upper oil pan, we do have a split that comes off of the galley from the oil filter and comes to lubricate these balance shaft bearings. Now over here on the engine block, you can see where that oil is going to be drawn in from the upper oil pan, and then it's going to go straight down to feed this main oil galley that feeds these sprayers over here. Our crankshaft also taps into that oil galley, going over here with these holes drilled this way to lubricate the crankshaft and connecting rod bearings. Now looking at the front of the engine, the main galley is over here. You can see where there's a T that comes across this way, and then when it comes up over this way to feed oil to the head for the variable valve timing system and the timing chain tensioner. Now overall, I think this engine is a pretty sturdy, reliable, easy to work on, and a very simple design from a design perspective. However, the implementation of certain things like the head bolts as well as the piston heads could have been improved upon. Now in my opinion, if you're looking for a used car with a 2.4 liter Toyota engine, I think you should try to avoid it just because of the oil burning and the head bolts issue, and either spring for the V6 model Camry or RAV4, or go for the newer 2.5 liter 4-cylinder engine if you can afford it. Make sure you follow me on Instagram if you want to see what's coming up next on Speedcar 99. Now one other problem with the 2AZ engine is its competition, which is the K-Series from Honda, which in my opinion is a very strong, sturdy and reliable engine and doesn't have any oil burning problems or head bolt problems like this engine, although you're going to be leaking a lot of oil going through VTEC gaskets all day long. So given these issues with vehicles of this era, it's probably better if you go with the Honda engine for reliability, but you're going to be rolling the dice on their transmissions, or you could just go with the manual.